ULEZ and an entire section called cons.
Right then, as soon as the last couple of people are sat down, we will get started. So please do move to chairs. There's plenty of space at the front if you need a seat. Thank you. Right then, I think we'll begin. Thank you everyone for coming here. My name is Finn McCarron. I'm the International Programme Manager here at the Conservative Environment Network, which is the independent forum for conservatives in the UK and abroad who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. If you're not part of our supporters network or our councillors network, I do encourage you all to sign up. But today we are here to talk about rural resistance and can we overcome the rural resistance to the energy transition, which is kindly sponsored by RWE on this panel. I will introduce all the panellists and they will do a 3-minute opening statement and then we will go into questions. So while I am talking, please do think of any questions you may have for our panel. You can tweet along at sen at CPC24 and our Twitter hashtag, Twitter username is at sen_HQ. Now, our panel of esteemed guests, we have Greg Hands, who is the former Energy Minister and the former Minister for the Net Zero Strategy, amongst others. And so I will ask him to start first. Greg.
Right, well, thank you, Finn, and thank you, everybody. It's delighted to be back at a conference, at my first event. Last year I was party chairman. Now I'm not even an MP, but that is the way today's Conservative Party is. But seriously, it's great to see everybody in good spirits. And I think the first thing in this thing is to recognise just what a huge success Britain's energy transition has been. I think many people in this room, if not most people in this room, maybe all people in this room, will recognise that. But I sometimes feel this might be a battle that we have to continue to go out and continue to keep winning. So let's just remind ourselves how successful this has been under the last government. A huge increase. The percentage of our energy mix that came from renewables was around about 7% in 2010, rising to around 45% today. So that was, an enormous success, and a lot of that was done through good conservative innovation, like, for example, contracts for difference, like, for example, building the Western world's leading offshore wind capacity, nuclear actually starting to be built. So let's not forget what a fantastic track record this party has got on the energy transition. But obviously the challenge now is ramping that up, not taking one's foot off the accelerator. There's a huge amount of challenge to get to the position where we're going to decarbonise our electricity supply and move to net zero by 2050. Just a reminder, I ceased being Energy Minister in 2022, but I think these targets are still current, that our target is to grow wind power to go from 11 gigawatts to 50 gigawatts by 2030, solar to go from 14 to 70 gigawatts, a 5-fold increase by 2035, and to get nuclear from 8 to 24 gigawatts by the year 2050. So those are huge increases. So we can't rest on our laurels and just say merely more of what we did before. It's got to be a real sort of change and step up in what we're doing. And obviously, all of these things come with infrastructure attached to them. And it's not just the electricity generation itself. It's also, of course, the transmission cabling, getting energy to from the point of production to the point of use as well. Now, all of these things are very, very controversial. Infrastructure in general, renewable energy infrastructure, I would say, in particular. It's worth recognizing that I think all of us in this room will think that there are huge advantages of renewable energy versus fossil fuels. I'm just going to name one advantage of fossil fuels, which we have to leave behind us, and that is the ability effectively to set up your energy infrastructure quite close to the point of use. It's not by accident that coal-fired power plants were in the middle of cities or at the outsides of cities, because you transport the coal to that point, burn the coal close to that point of use. I think one of the key things to understand with renewable energy, whether it be wind, whether it be solar, or whether it be nuclear, they all have a need to be in a particular place or a more particularly defined place. And I think that adds the challenges when it comes to infrastructure. I'd also say it's not a new controversy. Actually, when we in the last government were moving policy on onshore wind in 2015, that was because of the controversy and the unpopularity of onshore wind installations. That is now a good 10 years ago. Critics might say that this was, set back onshore wind. Supporters might say if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have given rise to such a huge expansion in offshore wind, which I think it's not a coincidence. The reason the UK has got the biggest offshore wind capacity was actually due to the controversies caused by onshore wind all those years ago. Now, I'm going to make two broad remarks about how do we deal with, or how do we engage with opponents. I think the first thing to recognize is that it's entirely legitimate. Virtually every political issue in this country is a case of, if you like, a minority who feel very passionately about something, like having a transmission cabling system coming down their back garden, or as they see it, vis-a-vis the broader majority who might be benefiting from that renewable energy. That is not an unusual position in UK politics. Politics in virtually every country pits engaged minorities versus more passive majorities. But a couple of things I would say. First is that not all of this infrastructure is, in my view, the same degree of controversiality. I think you have to look at how prominent the infrastructure is and the permanence of the infrastructure. By prominence, I mean how much visual impact is this actually having? And I do believe, for example, that solar farms, for example, have less visual impact than onshore wind. I'm going to throw that out as one example. And also to look at the permanence. Solar farms, for example, can be relatively rapidly deconstructed. The land could be returned back to agricultural land. I don't want to stray into the previous panel. So I think when looking at the different types of infrastructure, I think you've got to think about what is the prominence of that form of infrastructure and what is the permanence of that infrastructure. Also recognizing a lot of things can cohabit. Solar, I think, can cohabit on that land to some extent with certain things going on in agriculture. Offshore wind can certainly cohabit with fisheries and other things. So thinking about, you're not actually stopping this land either forever or entirely from being used for something else. And the second thing I would say, in terms, just to throw it out there really, I think in terms of infrastructure, building infrastructure anywhere, any type of infrastructure, it's always a heck of a lot easier where there's existing infrastructure. I don't want to relitigate an issue of 15 years ago, but I think it was a mistake to have not had HS2 following the West Coast Main Line and ploughing it through the Chilterns. I'm sure if the government were replanning it, would not have made that mistake because, there's a certain buy-in, if you like. When you think about motorways, it's easier to put an extra lane on an existing motorway than to build a brand new motorway. So I think a lot of these things we need to go with the existing flow. Where is the existing transmission cabling? Creating more onshore wind power is the answer, not to replace old turbines from 20, 15, 30 years ago, which are really underpowered, and put a new, more powerful turbine in the same place. So I just throw that out there, that there may be more pragmatic solutions to this rather than the sort of the big bang that's going on. So finally, I'll just say, in terms of possible solutions, look, we're in opposition now, so we don't have to have all the answers. I think the last government a lot of this stuff was still in its infancy, how to deal with local communities, particularly with rural communities. I had some familiarity with the row about what's called East Anglia Green, relative to the offset group of local authorities and local people who are really set against the East Anglia transmission cabling that was going on. We didn't really find a conclusion to that, but I think there's different things that can be done, compensation, reduction of bills, but I return to the earlier point about recognising the different types of infrastructure. I think if we start paying out a large amount of money for anybody who feels that they might be affected, we could end up, a bit like my HS2 example, really ramping up the cost of this infrastructure, which would have to be borne by all bill payers in the end. So a word of caution there. I think we should be pragmatic, we should be careful. I'm not sure that there is a blueprint solution to this, and we should definitely think about, in my view, the permanence of the infrastructure and the prominence of the infrastructure as a way to working out how we can compensate people, how we can buy people in. So that's all I say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Finn. Thanks.
Yep, and we'll come into that more in the questions, I'm sure. Now, the other end of the panel, I want to introduce Councillor Richard Clewer, who is the leader of Wiltshire Council, my home council, in fact. Richard.
Thank you. I think to start, I just wanted to reflect, at COP26 at a fringe meeting, I with hindsight, rather naively said the argument over net zero was over. And sadly, we seem to be having a lot of discussion about that now. In case anyone is wondering or worrying or thinking whether that argument is or isn't over, just a fact for you. In 75 years' time, on the most conservative of assumptions, roughly 1.4 million houses in London will be being flooded at least 2-3 times a year. Those houses will cost £321 billion to rebuild. The cost of not acting is far greater than the cost of acting. We've got to keep that in mind. Cost is actually a really important thing we've got to keep in mind here as well. So when I came to try and figure out what I could say that made sense on this topic, I was actually reading a document for Wiltshire, the LTP4, Local Transport Plan 4. And these documents are primarily written by consultants from metropolitan areas, and they talk about active travel and buses and all sorts of things like that, which is marvellous until you get to rural Wiltshire, where it doesn't work. Rural buses, and we've kept more than most, they're still pretty much, I wouldn't even say an aspiration, they're the unicorns. And so the solution, the one solution I've got to decarbonise transport in Wiltshire, and my goodness I want to, is EVs, electric vehicles. And to do that, they've got to be charged. And that then comes to the bigger context, which is grid capacity. And there may be some councillors in this room who don't have problems with grid capacity, but you're the minority if you are. We've got huge issues around the creaking Stalinist command control infrastructure of our energy system and the need to move to something that is far more distributive, far more micro-based, and far more able to actually deal with the demand we're placing on it. And that means some of that infrastructure, and I'll be unpopular at this point, some of those electricity pylons need to be built, not because we want them, but because they are absolutely strategically critical to energy flow around the country and to everything else we need to do. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that some of the infrastructure is going to have to be built, and some of us are going to be very unhappy when it is, but government is going to need to do it for the sake of that national picture. I don't have a good answer for people in that position, I'm afraid, apart from the fact if government doesn't do it, the implications for all of us are going to be more serious. But coming on to the more detail of the exam question, what can we do to try and help? Well, I think this is really a case of balance. We had a session on solar earlier. Solar farms, I've got solar farms through planning. I think they're a good thing, but they can go too far. I've got an application in the north of Wiltshire at the moment, Lyme Down, for a solar farm that will basically take 2 villages and surround them by solar panels completely. It will industrialise and remove all the tenant farmers. And that has wound up locals, as you would expect, something shocking. There is no way that there is no mitigation on the planet that will make those people happy to see their villages surrounded by solar and all of the farming. And okay, farming isn't 15-20% of a village like it used to be, but it's still 5-10% of a village community. There is no way they'll be happy seeing that go. So we've got to get balance here. We talk about the need for payback. Be careful with payback. One of my villages, Coombe Bissett, I'm sure they won't mind me mentioning them if they find out, has had a long-running argument that's only finally been resolved after about 12 years in the parish council of what to do with the gain they got from a solar farm. And the argument about what to spend it on was absurd and fascinating. But I think we need to be looking at something around, in the same way we have affordable housing contributions for when housing is built, some of it's affordable. If a community is taking infrastructure to provide grid of any form, including the big pylons, we need to be taking that affordable percentage there to apply to people, to give them something tangible, something real on their bills. That's probably the best answer I can come up with. The other thing I'll say, and I'm over 3 minutes, I apologise, is that the big energy companies, the solar companies here, have really got to up their game. The legal advice being given to people who are being asked to respond to pre-consultations from solar companies is don't give them the ammunition, save it for the planning application. Because they are gaming the system, they are playing games, they're trying to find little bits of information that they can use, not to make their applications any more palatable to people, but to help get them through the planning process. We have got to get some more responsible behaviour all round if this is going to work, and my goodness, it's got to work.
Thank you very much, Richard. All that talk of Lime Dam really reminds me of my family WhatsApp chats. So next we come to Dillon, who is the Energy and Environment Researcher at the Centre for Policy Studies.
Lovely, thank you, Finn. Finn asked me to discuss a couple other aspects, which is of this process. Ultimately, we've gotten all the in the dream scenario, we've gotten all the villagers on board. The company is ready to go, and yet there are still huge barriers to getting energy infrastructure up and running. One of those is, of course, planning, which my panelists have alluded to. But another huge thing that developers talk to me all the time about is grid connections. Maybe on the planning, actually, I'm going to shamelessly plug that my colleague Samuel Hughes will be publishing a paper very shortly on tweaks that the government can make to speed up some of the planning constraints, which we do hope they take on board. And actually, interestingly, over the last few months, we've been in this slightly strange position of being a conservative think tank that has to agree with some of the things that the Labour government has been doing on planning reforms for energy infrastructure and, other bits of it. Housing, for example, we strenuously disagree with, but on energy, for example, raising the thresholds for solar and wind to go into the NSIP process, that's, I think, a pretty good thing. Obviously, unblocking onshore wind in England, which has just been the most maddening thing for years and years and years, and they've swept all that away. I think it's up to us as conservatives not to oppose for the sake of opposing, and when they do things that will be helpful and get more energy projects off the ground, we should certainly applaud that. Connections reform, is sort of the other side of that coin, where because the grid is massively overloaded, there's a terrifying stat. I think the number of projects in the queue is something like 500 gigawatts overall, relative to the entire size of our system right now is about 75 gigs. So that is wildly more actual infrastructure than we'd ever need, and it's because it's so difficult to get a grid connection. You have so many projects putting in a speculative application. The queue is very slow. It's difficult. So the previous government gripped this issue quite strongly, put a lot of time into it, came out with the Connections Action Plan, which was essentially, in the most British way possible, better managing the queue. So, series of project gateways, removing speculative applications, essentially came up with a series of reforms that everybody thought was pretty sensible. And what did Ed Miliband do as soon as he got into office? Rip all that up. The Ofgem, which is the energy regulator, about 2 weeks ago put out a letter saying essentially they're going to ditch that, and the new plan is if you are not in the government's plan to get to 2030, so the government and the regulator are putting together, here is all the projects that we think we need to get to this crazy 2030 goal. If you're not in that plan, you're probably not getting a grid connection. And, maybe try again in 2031, which for those of us on the conservative side who want a more privatized energy system is deeply terrifying. The first come, first serve, as difficult as it was, at least allowed the private sector to it was the last bastion of private sector decision making. Ultimately, you as a developer should decide where your project will be located and then get a grid connection. But this disturbing creep towards statism that Ed Miliband represents, I think, is sort of doing away with that, and I worry that we're getting more and more into a very centrally planned energy mix. So the Labour government makes me happy in some terms and very unhappy in other terms. I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you. And now on to the first of our Davids. Dave Powell from Climate Outreach is the Senior Engagement Manager, and you can talk more to that.
Thank you. We're a dying breed, Davids. Apparently, it's hardly any get born anymore. So you can tell how old someone is by whether they're a David or not. So I'm Dave from Climate Outreach. We're a research organisation, a charity. We've been going about 20 years. We exist to help anyone talk to anyone about climate change, climate policy in a way that doesn't make them fight each other. That's the ideal. We've done a lot of work over the years on how people who on the right can talk to other people on the right, and the differences about that and how it works on the left. So it's great to be here, and I really wanted to start by saying it's so important what the Conservative story on this stuff is. Greg is right that you're not in government anymore, but the story that falls out of what happens with this party in the next 5 years, I think is critical. It's critical to the speed of the transition we want to have. It's critical to how efficiently it happens. It's critical to whether the UK polarises or stays broadly on the same boat. I do think it matters for where we are with net zero, so thank you for having me here. And I'm also going to assume that we do need this infrastructure. People who are cleverer than me can debate the mechanics of that. So everything I'm saying is assuming stuff is going to be built. And just a bit of... Finn asked me to talk about what's the best way to get people who might be in opposition to something to kind of lower that opposition, right? And I think Richard's right for a start, that for a lot of people you just can't. Let's not be all airy-fairy about it. I think sometimes people think communications can fix things that are like fundamentally just unpopular. They can't. Some people aren't going to like a thing being built near them, and that's kind of how it is, right? But there are some things that we know from our research that are perhaps amenable to doing both the communications and the involvement side of things differently. And perhaps a little way of thinking about it is imagining I don't know, maybe people in this room, I'm sure you do, are thinking about actual projects being proposed in your area. Or maybe you're lucky and you don't have that to think about, but imagine a beautiful place that you loved, someone was going to build on it. What would persuade you that actually it might be all right, or at least less horrific? So at the end of my garden, I live in a flat in South London. At the end of my garden, there's a bit of wasteland which someone is going to turn up one day and build a house on. It is going to happen. My cat plays in that wasteland. There's a beautiful tree. She goes out there. She's always up there chasing birds. At the back of my house is a gorgeous big sycamore tree. I love it. And when the houses come, I will be devastated for that, and I'll be angry about it, and I'll want it to stop. What would make me feel better about it would be firstly feeling someone had genuinely bothered to ask me what I thought should happen instead, and ideally a sense that thing had happened, and I trusted the process was fair, and I trusted the story that was told to me. And I think those are two principles. We know that people in general, sorry Finn, I haven't quite finished. We know that people in general, this is a increasingly distrustful society. People are not sure about the motivations of politicians in general, telling Greg something he definitely knows. Not sure about the motivations of developers, with respect to colleagues here. And I think actually showing that we are serious about listening to people and trusting them to have a grown-up conversation is really important. And then the second point is just that big vision and the story. Why are we doing all this stuff for? There's an economic case. There's a renewal case. There's a getting Britain back on its feet case. There's a climate case. All of these things need to be told in the right way, in language that actually speaks to the people you're talking to, by people who have a local stake, by Richard, where he can talk to people in this area. So get the involvement right and get the story right, and I'm sure we'll say more about that in questions.
Brilliant, thank you. And on to our second David, which is David Hickling, the head of UK Public Affairs at RWE, which is the UK's largest power producer and also the kind sponsor of our panel. David.
Thank you, Finn, and hello everyone. Pleasure to be here and support this event today, and thank you very much for the panellists for agreeing to join as well. So just really quickly on RWE, as Finn says, leading power generator. We power about 12 million homes in the UK through our portfolio of onshore wind, offshore wind, hydro, biomass and gas, so we have a broad spectrum of generation technologies. And that's about 10 gigawatts of generation. On top of that, we have about 17 gigawatts in the development pipeline, so a lot coming down the line. So we've got a real stake in what's happening here in terms of the energy transition in the UK. That includes 10 new offshore wind farms, 2 gigawatts of onshore wind, 4.5 gigawatts of solar, and nearly 4 gigawatts of battery storage as well. Our investments have been about €3 billion in the last 3 years in the UK, and we expect them, or hope them, to be about €8 billion net up to 2030. We have been involved in the development of energy projects in the UK's rural communities for over 25 years. So we have a real breadth and depth of experience here. We're not a here today, gone tomorrow developer. We're really proud of our stewardship of our projects over the long term, and that obviously includes building positive, enduring relationships with the local communities that host our projects. And that includes things like community benefit funds. Over their lifetime, the community benefit funds for our existing projects, onshore and offshore wind, will invest over £100 million into local communities across the UK. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. So to answer the question of the panel title, can we overcome the real resistance to clean energy transition? Well, the short answer is yes. And yes, we can, with good practice and with good policy as well. The slightly longer answer is that I challenge the notion that rural communities are actually resisting the energy transition. I don't actually think that that's the case. I think rural communities can play one of the most integral roles in the transition, and I think actually there is recognition and support for that in those communities as well. Department of Energy Security's Public Attitudes Tracker shows regularly high support for renewable energy in rural areas. There was polling by More in Common for the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit earlier this year, showing rural voters have a higher level of concern of climate change, strong support for the net zero target. Voters in those areas are more supportive of renewable energy generally than the national average, and rural voters are more likely to have noticed climate impacts in their area as well, which might explain the original stats. And as we've discussed and have been discussed on previous panels here today already, there are a number of positive opportunities to rural communities from hosting local energy projects. So that's investment and jobs, both direct and indirect. It's around the community benefit that I mentioned. It's around that opportunity for environmental restoration as well. And it's also making that strong contribution to the UK's energy security. You know, rural communities can be at the vanguard of securing that. And sometimes when people say we don't want energy generation to happen here, we want it to happen over there. Well, over there, if you go far enough, is in Russia, I'm afraid. And if you look at the previous experience, that is that Russia and other countries are ultimately where we end up getting our energy from if we don't do it domestically. So there's a real role for rural communities here. So then just a quick point on some of the questions that Finn had directed me to maybe answer from the developer's perspective, what sort of resistance we do encounter in bringing projects forward and how we can work with local communities. It's obviously in our interests as a long-term presence in those communities to work hard to achieve best practice engagement through our development, construction and the operation of our projects. We know there's always going to be some degree of opposition to developments in local areas. That's fair enough. Energy is not unique in this, happens with anything essentially that we're trying to develop. People's concerns range from practical concerns, so that could be from the location of the site. We've heard some of that here today. The impact of the development as we're bringing it forward, maybe on the construction, traffic, road closures, noise, to personal objections, potentially around concerns on visual impact. That's a matter of opinion. Some people like it, some people are agnostic, some people really don't. Or perceptions about overdevelopment in a local area as well. Things like impact on house prices as well. But again, I would stress that they're perceptions rather than necessarily facts. We maybe get onto some of those points later. And then some people just have a philosophical objection to clean energy. They don't believe that it's the solution for the UK, and fair enough position to have. I would contest it and disagree with it, but that's sometimes what we get from people in those local communities as well. So we've got to work hard to try and win that argument. And we've got to build trust in those communities by making sure that our projects are developed in liaison and engagement with the community in order to win that trust. So that takes the form of good extensive consultation, not just the formal consultation, but also informal consultation ahead of time. It's around amendments to schemes as well. It's around having stable points of contact so that we're accessible to communities as well. And it's also about talking about the wider benefits that those developments bring, including environmental benefits, biodiversity net gain, nature restoration, considerate construction, and setting out our commitments formally to this as well, and also the community benefit. So I think there's lots we can do as a developer. The responsibility is on our shoulders to bring forward our projects in a really good way and follow best practice. But there's also a role for national policy as well. And maybe we get on more to that as well about the government can do to help build an effective planning system that builds confidence, support communities to get more involved in energy projects that we're bringing forward as well. So looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Finn.
Brilliant. Now, this is normally the part where I'd ask a question, but I'm conscious of time and I want to get as many of your questions in as possible. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please put your hands up, and there are some members of the SEND team with microphones, I believe. So let's start right at the front here. And we'll take batches of about 3 questions.
Thelma Mattert from Sutton Coldfield. Why did it take the Conservative government so long in getting the nuclear small reactors from Rolls-Royce through? I mean, last year when I attended the conference, I think it had gone to the second or the third phase. I don't know where it is now, but bearing in mind nuclear is such a clean energy, why did it take us so long? Thank you.
Brilliant. Other hands. If you go across the room over to that gentleman.
Hi, I'm Tom Howard. I'm in energy communications. I wanted to ask, we've heard a lot about there being rural resistance, but we've also heard a lot about that the polling doesn't necessarily suggest that everyone is against it. Can anyone speak to any success stories of where community engagement has gone incredibly well, the community's been on board, and actually it's all gone very well?
Brilliant. You're the best room all day for asking actual questions and not statements. Just in the aisle there, that lady there.
Liz Pace from Ealing. I'm just interested in job creation in rural communities. You didn't mention economic benefits for local people at all. Are there no jobs being created for people who live in villages or small market towns?
Brilliant, thank you. Let's take these three. So we've got, why are SMRs taking so long? Are there any actual success stories with rural communities? And do these things create any jobs? Can I start over this side of the panel with who wants to take any of these?
Yeah, I'll answer a couple of them. So nuclear, I can't answer. That's one of the technologies we're not involved in, after saying we're involved in a load of technologies. I'll leave that to someone else to answer. But certainly on the success stories, I think you can never sort of claim complete total success, because there's always going to be, as having a development there, as you bring it forward, there's always going to be bumps in the road and things like that. But I think we are quite proud and feel that, I personally, I'm not aware that we have a project, and we've got upwards of 80, 90 projects across the UK, all range of different sizes, where we have bad relations with our community. I think we put a lot of work in to keep those relations good, to make sure that we're following the best practice, not just as we're building it, but for the rest of the lifetime as well. And perhaps, I think the accessibility point is really strong there, because I think people feel that they can come and speak to us about any issues they may have. We have local community liaison groups for many of our projects that meet on a regular basis to be able to talk about those things. We let people know what we're doing in advance, things like that. But also, we have some examples as well around where we have consulted and we've gone beyond where what we've needed to, and we've actually delivered different changes to the project based on what people have said. So it's a couple of our offshore wind projects, and whilst the turbines are going offshore, actually the cabling that comes onshore is an area that people quite rightly have views about. And with our Owellimore offshore wind farm that we're currently developing off the coast of North Wales, our statutory requirement was to consult with just the local authority most immediately impacted by that wind farm. But we get that that's probably not quite. We could have done that, but instead we went to all the local authorities across the top of North Wales. So all of those local authorities had an opportunity to feed into our consultations, and we broadened that out massively, because we just felt, well, that just makes sense to do that, because it's not just honed into a local authority boundary. People don't work on that basis. Normal people, we all do, in the political world, of course. But so that was an example of broadening out the opportunity to comment. And then when we came back from listening to those views, it was really clear that visual impact of that project was something that people felt quite important, strongly about. And close to Snowdonia, and people thought that there was an impact there. And actually what we did was reduce the size of the site that we were going to build the turbines in by a third, and moved it away from the Snowdonia area, so people would not see as much of the wind farm from that part of the world, and also reduce the number of turbines as well. There's to stress that this idea that what we're presenting to people is a fait accompli when we go out to consultation is definitely not the case. We can definitely change our project because we want to win that community support. It's much better for us to be present in the community for 30 years, 25 years with good relations than have a 25-year headache because we didn't get that right at the start. It just makes perfect sense for us to do that. So that's an example there. I've got plenty more, but I won't hog the time in response to people.
I'm just going to deal with the nuclear question, because it's something which came across my desk as Energy Minister. And you're right, it has been a slow and frustrating process. Don't forget, however, for the first 5 years of the last government, we were in coalition with a party which is wholly against nuclear. So a lot of these things would simply have not have been possible in those first 5 years with the Liberal Democrats, who have always been very, very strongly opposed to nuclear. I mean, there's two parts to the process. One is the, if you like, the safety certification of the technology, which is done independently of government by the I think it's the ONR, the Office of Nuclear Regulation, off the top of my head. That is quite a lengthy process where they certify that the technology, and we can all say, well, this is great technology, it's proven technology, is being used in UK nuclear submarines, etc., but nonetheless it does have to go through that process. And that is done independently of government. The second part is, what does the UK itself do? And here, again, we have to be careful. It's very expensive. All nuclear installations are very expensive, and we have to make sure we're getting the best value for money for the UK taxpayer. That, if you like, is a Treasury-led process which takes longer, I think, than it should, but nonetheless is there. The third thing, where I think is fantastic technology, fantastic British technology, the one thing I focused on, particularly when I was Trade Minister, was on exporting this technology and the ability to, particularly after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, being able to use nuclear SMR technology as part of a solution to European countries in particular that have become overly dependent on Vladimir Putin. So Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, very interested in SMR technology, working with Rolls-Royce to get into those doors of local energy ministries and sell that product and that capability into those places. But I think the short answer to your question is yes, it has been frustratingly long, and it's been frustratingly too long, but we have been getting on with it, particularly, I'd say, the last 3 or 4 years on an accelerated way, and I'm looking forward to seeing the Rolls-Royce SMR technology at use, not just in this country, but across whole parts of Europe and parts of Asia as well.
Thank you. Dillon, I saw you writing as soon as the SMR question got asked. Do you want to come in on that?
I'll add just briefly to what Greg was saying. Yeah, we're certainly big supporters of nuclear and SMRs as well, so it's been frustrating to see how long the process has taken. It's interesting. The government had essentially, the new government had been crickets for 2 or 3 months. Just last week they announced that they've gone from 5 down to 4 of the providers in the competition, so fingers crossed, we should get an answer at some point soon. Maybe also just to sort of, I don't want to curb your enthusiasm for SMRs, but it's worth bearing in mind. I've spoken to some of the developers in the US who are building the first ones now. No SMR anywhere in the world is currently operating. The first ones are expected to come on stream in like 2030, 2031. People in the UK think they hopefully will start actually generating power in like 2035. So big believer in them, but they're not going to pitch up into your constituency next year, unfortunately.
Brilliant. Dave and Richard, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I know nothing about SMRs.
Maybe on jobs then.
Yeah, about something that unites the other two questions was the question about, firstly, you started off with a question about the dissonance between kind of headline support for it, but then obviously sort of strong opposition. And what we found from our research and what Public First found, who did some great research on this, is a couple of things lower opposition when you ask them. Firstly, a sense that the project, the site, is in some way ours. In some way, conceptually, feels like it's ours. And, this is not a sort of attack on RWE by any means, but a sense that it's not just going away somewhere else. Someone is not coming and doing this to us. It is in some way ours. Polling for Labour's Great British Energy, the reason people like that phrase is implicit within it is an idea of kind of retaining our wealth somewhere. So that's really important. And then the second thing is local benefit, the idea that there will be something in it for us tangibly. And I'm Welsh, so half Welsh, so I should be able to do this, but I can't. There's a wind farm in Wales called Pennycumyrdd or something like that. I really can't pronounce it, do forgive me. But where they've got, there's a Vattenfall project where they've got a 1.8 million fund a year staffed by a team of people for community benefit. Projects in the local area can apply. Community engagement has been an ongoing thing. That site I know is much more popular. I don't have the figures in front of me, but they took that local benefit thing really seriously. It's still a developer-led site, but they were serious about the engagement. I'm sure David knows more about that.
Brilliant. And Richard?
Really quickly. Overcoming resistance. 3 wind farms in my division. One came to committee, had some best and most versatile land on. We said, can you think again? They went away, thought again, came back to committee. No one complained. It was approved. They'd taken out the land that concerned people. Good functioning solar farm. Another one going to be built between a sewage treatment plant and a B&Q on a water meadow. They engaged properly with all the parishes around. They had events. It was the right site. No one complained. Grid connection, too expensive, can't be built. And then one just been rejected, has no grid connection and no prospect of one, but they still wanted permission and 50% best and most versatile, and they wouldn't move. And the opposition couldn't be overcome on that. So you can do it, but you've got to compromise. You can't dictate. You've actually got to compromise, properly compromise. Job creation, really tricky, interesting one. In Wiltshire, unemployment is effectively, it's effectively frictional unemployment. Most of the unemployment I've got is either people who are never going to look for a job or who are moving between jobs. I have a desperate need for people to fill jobs in rural environments. So more rural employment actually would worry me because I don't know where to fill it from. There are other parts of the country where that does not apply, but for large parts of the country that is the case. Although, if we build giant solar farms that take out all the farming, we might have some unemployed people we need to put into jobs, but then a large solar farm doesn't actually employ people in a meaningful way because it just sits there. So I think the jobs issue is really complex.
Thank you. Should we go to some more audience questions? And we've got, once again, we'll start up at the front and work our way backwards. So we've got this gentleman here.
I need some advice from the panel. My name is Mark, I'm from West Yorkshire. My district is very left-wing, quite green, but also very rural. Lies about halfway between Bradford and Manchester. The moor there, which is the core of our ward, is called Wiltshire, and it's a lot of it is peat moorland. The top of it, which is the site of, as you might have guessed it, a large onshore wind farm, 65 turbines generating about 0.3 gigawatts a year, so not small. Each of the order of 650 feet high, so that's as high as the Blackpool Tower, and 65 of them, bordering on Haworth district, which of course is the home of the Brontes, and one landmark right beside this site is Top Withens, which was the inspiration for Wuthering Heights. It's also a peat bog, and therefore building on it at all will damage the nature of the carbon sink that's every peat bog is.
Can I ask what advice you would like from our panel?
Well, you can tell I am not happy, and neither is the community, despite being very green and left wing. Do you think that it should go through?
Okay, do you think that some building should go through on this one particular site? Do we have any more questions to go through? We've got a woman right at the back there on the same side.
Hi, my house is in the most southerly village in mainland Britain on the Lizard Peninsula. We have wind farms within a mile of us. And we are not at all resistant to that. What we would like to see is that have a benefit to our village, because the infrastructure from those wind farms is excellent, out to the grid, etc., and off to the cities, marvellous. But we can expect, as soon as that wind really gets up, we can expect power cuts every other week. Because there's a lack of investment in our infrastructure actually delivering the electricity to our homes. So we still all have oil tanks in our gardens because we cannot rely on the grid to deliver electricity to our homes. And I think that's a key thing for rural communities. We're up for clean energy, but it doesn't deliver for us.
Okay, great. And then I saw some hands across the room, across the aisle. Yep.
Thank you. John Lancaster, Conservative Group Leader on Cardiff County Council. Isn't the question posed in the title here made pretty much redundant by Greg Hand's, something you touched on in your opening statement, which is that energy generation is served best when it's close to the point of consumption? So doesn't that lend itself to the conclusion that renewable energy generation should be in urban areas as far as possible? Things like solar panels should be in urban areas like schools, hospitals, factories, and so on, and not in rural areas where they conflict with things like agricultural use.
Okay, brilliant. Why don't we take those questions? And Greg, I'll start with you, as that last one was a direct challenge to your opening statement.
Thank you, and I'll try and I don't feel particularly expert, having been MP for Chelsea and Fulham, and answering the West Yorkshire Pete Moorland question. But I think John's question about electricity generation, I think what I was trying to get across was that, like in previous generations, electricity generation is located close to the point of consumption, and now it mostly isn't, because you've got to, if you like, follow where the energy is being generated. So I'm not saying necessarily we should go back to that. I'm just saying that was, if you like, if you had to line up all the advantages of renewable energy, you'd have a huge page about, 2 pages, and you line up the advantages of fossil fuels, there'd be a few things. That would be one of them. I mean, I think your question about doing more in urban areas is very right, and we should maximise urban areas' ability to generate renewable energy. However, I think that is currently, in current technology, relatively restricted. I think even if I don't have the figures in front of me, but I remember looking at this argument, even if we put solar panels on like every single school for the sake of argument, it still would be a small fraction of what we need compared to the economies of scale that you get from a much bigger solar farm or solar enterprise. So I don't think you're wrong. And definitely we need to do more of that. I think in that area the UK is behind Germany and behind Scandinavia in particular. We should definitely be incentivising more urban environments. I think it would be a mistake, by the way, without going off too much of a tangent, to mandate new build homes to have solar panels, because I think that is easier said than done. I think we'd end up killing off a lot of new housing. But I think we should be generating more in urban areas. I just don't think that is, if you like, the silver bullet that's going to solve the problem overall of our big increased need for renewable energy overall. But I think in concept, you're absolutely right.
Right. Why don't we start this end this time?
Thanks. Right. I'll start with disagreeing with what Greg just said about new housing. It is institutional insanity that we still allow houses to be built that are not net zero. All my council housing is built to a net zero standard. It costs between 2% and 4% more, and it's slightly larger as well. So I fundamentally disagree with you on that one, but okay. In terms of the other points, microgeneration, generating electricity closer to where it's used, is going to be required. We're all going to be sitting there with EVs, with a battery that's going to be able to feed back into the grid at peak times and draw from the grid at times when energy is available. That distributive network is really important, and it's going to need to be developed, and that's a huge challenge, and it's going to require more software engineers, I think, than anything else to make happen. But the point about having energy being generated locally or in urban areas, I think, is really important when it comes to people being willing to accept what's going on. Whenever you pass an industrial site and don't see solar panels on the roof and then solar panels in the field next to it, you think, well, someone's got that wrong. I have a lot of the army in Wiltshire. They're rubbish at putting solar panels on their sheds, and they've got a huge amount of shed space. So it won't fix the problem, but it'll make the rest of us a heck of a lot more comfortable that we've used those sites first and then have got to use other sites. So it'll give us the balance that'll get us over that line. And this is about balance. This is about feeling that we're not being done to, we're being done with. Back to your grid issue, yeah. Someone should be... I mean, a properly distributed grid would mean you wouldn't have this ridiculous Stalinistic 1950s system of energy, pushing energy everywhere it needs to be. It should be pushing and pulling from all the different sources. Your wind turbines, you're never going to persuade people on a site that sensitive. But I used to be quite concerned about wind. My mother has a house in Skye. I really like it up there. They built turbines just over the horizon. I actually find them really comforting now, because that's clean, renewable energy that's helping a place I really care about stay natural and good. So there are benefits there, but you're probably going to have to go through the pain to get to them.
Brilliant, Dave. How about you?
So I think mostly on Mark, wasn't it? Mark's point. I just wanted to talk about nature briefly, because I think all of this involves trade-offs, right? And the nature trade-off is a critical one. And I think without knowing the ins and outs of your site, it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is an impact on nature, a perceived impact on nature. And I think we need to be very careful about how we need to do those trade-offs properly. I'm not saying that means nature always trumps wind turbines or wind turbines always trump nature, but we need to do it properly. For 3 reasons. Firstly, because nature's in a right old state, and we need to take that as seriously as we take carbon emissions. Secondly, because people love nature, and it's one of the things they love most about where they live is what it looks like and what lives in it, and its greenness. And we're a country of nature lovers, and we know that. And thirdly, because it's through nature that people's wider environmental consciousness comes. When we talk to people about climate change, at climate outreach, they'll normally start talking about nature and how they like that, or water, or these things. So we do have to take that seriously. And the furthest I will go into the whole planning thing is I think all of this points to the need for proper spatial planning, right? There's all these trade-offs have to be done between protecting and enhancing nature, getting the renewables that we need in the right place at the right time, and the houses that we need, and properly giving people a say at an early enough stage in all this, so that the planning system's not just used defensively to stop things you want, it can actually be a vehicle for shaping a place in a much more sustained way. That's my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Great. Dillon?
I will keep it brief and agree with everything the panel has said on, particularly on microgeneration and rooftop solar. You know, it's won't get us 100% of the way there, but to Richard's point, yeah, let's please do all of it that we can, so we can be sure that we've sort of tried that first. The one point that I would just make on the sort of the rural electricity generation point is absolutely. Hopefully, in 10 or 15 years, you'll have an EV sitting in your driveway that can store power and then give it back to your house. The same, you can actually today buy power packs that go up in your garage, and they're slightly bulky things, but can do precisely the same thing and store quite a bit of power. I'll also slightly plug locational pricing. So one of the things that free market energy nerds like me love to bang on about is the fact that across GB, our electricity price, at least in the wholesale market, is the same. So if presuming you're on the price cap right now, your bills, to be fair, are slightly different depending on where you are in the country, but not massively. Which is kind of silly, right? The way a lot of electricity infrastructure is working right now is these wind farms are getting built in very windy places, which tend to be rural and out of the way, and then you need to pipe that power to London or the other demand centers. In a free market system, you benefiting from that wind turbine should be paying far cheaper rates for your electricity than me sitting in Islington consuming that power, right? If you just think about it from a demand and supply perspective, that's an incentive that absolutely should be put in place. And the fact that it's not, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why people don't like it, but it's one of the things that we think could really help overcome rural resistance to say, hey, we are going to put this turbine here, but you're going to have way cheaper power as a result, not just as a sort of community benefits thing, but it's fundamentally changing how the market works. It's really important. I thought I'd just put in for it.
Brilliant. And David?
So I think the main overarching point to all three of those questions is about coexistence, right? And the fact that we need to consider everything. It's not just one solution or one technology. So, the point about the onshore wind farm, that I'm not going to comment on the individual project. I'm 99% sure it's not an RWE project, so I don't need to say yes, let's build it. But it's around what can it do to minimise its environmental impact. And we have projects in the Scottish Highlands, for example, that undertake a hell of a lot of peatland restoration, for example, close by to them. So there can be that coexistence, but I don't know the specifics on the individual project. On the point about the local energy grid, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think the point's been made that we're going to see a huge, multiple times increase in electrification across our economy in the next 20 to 30 years. And that's going to be our houses using multiple times more electricity than they did when we have to charge our EV or our battery packs and things like that. So we absolutely need to be investing in that distributed grid network, as well as the generation that's plugging into the big transmission network as well. So it's not an either or case for that as well. And I think the point with regards to doing it in urban areas, I think Greg made the point really well. There was a discussion about that in the previous panel about solar, and I went away and checked some facts about that, and I think it's quite interesting that, yes, we absolutely need to be maximising what is done in urban areas, but just some facts about how much can be generated from doing that. In August this year, we have 1.3 million installations, solar installations that are below 4 kilowatts. So that's probably your small scale domestic solar installations. That in total is generating about 4 gigawatts. So not insignificant, but that's 1.3 million installations. I then looked at the sites that were 25 megawatts plus, so your slightly bigger ones, probably your ground-mounted projects. There's 58 of those sites, and they're producing 2.3 gigawatts. So 58 of those sites are getting pretty close to, or a decent proportion of, what the 1.3 million installations are producing. So you can't just do it in urban areas and forget about rural areas, I'm afraid. You are just not going to produce the amount of energy that you need to if you're serious about the transition and the role that solar is going to play. So it's both, basically, I think.
Okay, great. I think we're going to come to closing statements now, and I'll do it in the order that we did our opening statements in. So, Greg, if you've got 1 minute of closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a great panel, and thank you. There's certainly plenty of food for thought. The one thing I really got nothing to add to what I said earlier, but the one thing I might just add is that there's a danger in setting any structure in this area that is too permanent. Technology will change, technology will evolve. And one of the things when I did the net zero strategy in 2021 was I thought, well, here I'm being asked to set a strategy for 30 years as to exactly how we're going to get to net zero. I'm supposed to map it all out and everything else. And I thought, well, hold on a minute, 30 years is an incredibly long time. And if I had been doing that exercise in 1990 for 2021, you could imagine it would have been a laughable exercise. So I just throw it out there that we should also build in a large amount of flex into everything that we're planning to do, because technologies will change, technologies will evolve. Don't follow a wholly sort of Stalinist predict and provide model going ahead the next 15 years or so. So that's the only thing I add, really. But beyond that, I just think we should be mindful of the different technologies. They're not all the same. Mindful of the permanence of those technologies, and mindful of the fact that some things are transmission cables, huge transmission cables going through East Anglia are going to be really unpopular. We have to find a way of keeping MPs, councils, communities on board on those kind of things. And I don't think just persuading the renewable energies in itself a great thing is going to be enough to cut it.
Great, thank you. Richard, final remarks.
Thanks. Having disagreed with Greg on housing, I'm going to strongly agree with what he's just said, because we've got a new government that's coming in and it's like a sort of bruiser on a block throwing its weight around without thinking about consequences. We've got changes proposed to the MPPF to basically mean solar farms will be there in perpetuity, pretty much automatic planning renewal, things like that. What we need here is some thoughtful balance. Something that doesn't create this sort of dictatorial system, and something that is just much more about listening to people and finding that compromise. People are reasonable. They'll compromise. If you sell them something that actually makes sense, they'll buy it. That's what we need to do.
Great. Dillon?
Yeah, I guess I echo both of what my co-panelists have been saying, and I fear I'm slightly going to steal Dave's lunch on this, but transmission pylons, what's difficult about them, obviously, the visual impact is quite tough. They're kind of ugly. Nobody likes them. Fair. And yet, as one of my panelists was mentioning, if you poll people, support for net zero and action on net zero and renewable energy is very high. And the thing is, I fear that we haven't quite created the link in people's minds between pylons and net zero in the same way that we have for solar panels and wind turbines. I think it was last year the grid operator did a whole program, the Great Grid Upgrade, talking about why we need more pylons. And I think from a comms perspective, if we can explain this to people, I'm sorry, I know it's ugly, but believe me, if you want cheaper energy bills, that pylon is going to get them for you. I hope that we can slightly get over that hump.
Great, thank you. Plea for pylons. Dave?
Yeah, he has nicked my lunch. Apparently 1% of people say they like pylons. But I reckon they tick the wrong box. That's the only thing I think about it. My mum said to me when she was a kid, there was national campaigns talking about how brilliant pylons were. And she said we need that again, and then we had a big argument about it because I just not the same. because you're not getting something new like you were in the 50s, 60s. It was like a new thing. This is not the same. But what would that be? What would the story be that would be an exciting one about renewal and rebuilding and these things? And I think just the other point to make, I didn't make it in my opening remarks. Other people made it for me. But one of the things that has always dogged renewables, particularly amongst political types, is thinking there's more opposition than there is, because it's dominated by noisy people, noisy, loud people. Greg will know, right, who writes to you. It's not people who think things are basically all right, is it? So there is something, I think, there's something in understanding. Yes, there are pockets of people who don't like it, but there's a lot more sort of common sense support out there. And the bits of it that I think can be amenable to changing are the bits that are around trust and having a say and feeling benefits coming locally. And if we crack that at the margins, we could make a really big difference.
Brilliant. And finally, David.
Thank you very much. I do like pylons personally, but unfortunately we bury all our cables that come on shore, so we don't actually build any. So they all go underground. But never mind. That causes problems as well. That's not a silver bullet. So just 5 key points I want to make really quickly, just to sum up. I think the discussion and the points I wanted to make here. And it was firstly to challenge that notion that rural communities are all opposed and resist the clean energy transition. I don't think that's the case at all. I think we've sort of demonstrated that here today. I think there are really positive opportunities to rural communities from hosting local energy projects, and that needs to be maximised. And we get that there's a responsibility for us as a developer, but also for government and local authorities and others to play a role there. It's absolutely in our interest to build and win that community support for our projects, and we work really hard to achieve that. National policy can play a role in supporting the development of the projects. That better strategic planning of the energy system, I think within reason the state can do something, but as I think we've heard some concerns about maybe overreach here potentially as well. Maybe helping local communities do more to be able to get involved in energy projects. Just a quick point is that we offer communities to take ownership of a proportion of our projects sort of as standard in the UK, and they can't take it up because they don't have the money, they don't have the capacity to do it. In Germany, that we do that as standard. It's not a radical departure of what happens in our projects over there, but it's because of the way our local government system's set up here, we can't do that. So completely take the point around ownership. We'd be happy to do it. And finally, just the point around, a plea. We're in the leadership election here in the Conservative Party. There is a role here, a space for the Conservative Party to really represent the views of rural communities without retreating to a position of outright opposition, I think. And that's the point I really want to make today. And I think most of the room is probably in agreement with that.
Thank you. You couldn't have set me up better for my final remarks.
I've stolen them, yeah.
If you are interested in making sure that the leadership candidates are all giving a strong offering on the environment, I do encourage you to sign up as a SEND supporter, and also to sign our letter specifically calling on the leadership candidates. The QR code is on the screen. It is also in any of the notebooks you will have picked up today, or indeed on your Cleaner Communities Councillor slips. I have nothing else to say except thank you very much to all of our panellists. Thank you to RWE for sponsoring. And our next event is in half an hour in this room called Net Zero is Net Zero Conservative Mission with Lord Frost, amongst other people. So stick around for that. Thank you very much.